public humiliation. It was an ordinary day at the bank, or at least it seemed like it. Marcos entered with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what to do. Owner of a network of successful clinics, turning over millions annually, he was not just any customer. But what he didn't know was that on that day he would be treated differently. Not because of your finances or your status, but because of the color of your skin. Have you ever stopped to think about how many times you, unintentionally, were judged just by your appearance? And worse, how many times have you been led to believe that a person could be less capable or less worthy for completely superficial reasons? In the 21st century, many still face the harsh reality of being evaluated not by what they know, but by how they are seen by others. This is the sad story of Marcos, who, when trying to carry out a simple transaction, saw his life turned upside down, when he was publicly humiliated for a simple detail, being black. But what Marcos did next was not what was expected. Instead of remaining silent, he stood up. He refused to be just another face in a crowd of invisible victims. Not only did he face discrimination at that time, he used it as fuel to change his reality and that of many others around him. Marcos's story, like so many others, began as a personal affront, but soon turned into a much larger struggle, the fight against institutional racism. This is not just a report of another isolated case. It is not a unique story that can be easily forgotten. It is a powerful reflection on what it means to live in a society where appearance can determine the access and treatment we receive. And, most importantly, it is a story about how one individual's reaction can change the course of that story and inspire thousands to question the structure that oppresses them. Marcos didn't know how transformative that situation would be. What seemed like a simple banking error would become a milestone in the fight for equality. But this all starts with a careful look, with an attitude that challenges the status quo, and with the courage to be more than a victim. The courage to become a voice that echoes for all those, like him, who have been silenced by invisible systems of oppression. And you, have you ever stopped to think about how many times this story repeats itself around you? How many times does something like this happen and people just turn their heads, let it go, without realizing that they are complicit in perpetuating discrimination? What Marcos did on that bench was not only demanding justice for himself, but also giving a voice to those who, for years, have been invisible, marginalized by a system that sees them only as numbers or stereotypes. But the real question is, what would happen if all the Marcoses decided to react in the same way? If everyone who faces racism stood up instead of hanging their heads? Maybe the change was already underway, just needing a push. And perhaps that simple banking error was the trigger the world needed to finally see the injustice that goes unnoticed every day. The incident experienced by Marcos was not an isolated case. In fact, it is part of a historical pattern of discrimination that, despite having been widely recognized and debated, still persists in institutions and organizations at different levels. What Marcos experienced at the bank is a clear reflection of institutional racism, which occurs when the practices, policies, and behaviors of an organization, whether public or private, favor one racial group to the detriment of others, generally in relation to those who belong to marginalized groups, such as the black population. But what exactly is institutional racism? The concept of institutional racism was first introduced in the 1960s by academics and activists such as Stokely Carmichael and Charles V. Hamilton, who defined the term as a set of norms and practices that, intentionally or unintentionally, discriminate against certain racial groups, creating barriers to their access to resources and opportunities. To understand the scope of this type of discrimination, it is necessary to look at the systems that govern our everyday lives. Education, health, public safety, and, of course, the job market and financial institutions. A clear example of how institutional racism manifests itself in finance can be seen in recent data. A study carried out by the Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics, IBG, reveals that, in Brazil, black people earn on average 56% of the salary of white people, despite occupying positions of equal responsibility. Additionally, black people have less access to bank credit, face higher interest rates, and are often disqualified from their applications due to subtle but deeply rooted bias. This phenomenon is global, and it is possible to observe similar practices in other countries. In the United States, a Federal Reserve study revealed that African Americans and Latinos are less likely to obtain bank loans than whites, even when they have the same financial and credit profile. In the United Kingdom, a report by the Equality and Human Rights Commission (HRC) showed that black people face a double of challenges: explicit racial prejudice combined with structural barriers that hinder their professional and financial advancement. These statistics are not just numbers, they are reflections of a reality faced by millions of people every day. How is this reflected in Marcos's life? Returning to Marcos's story, we can observe that the treatment he received when trying to carry out a simple transaction was a clear example of institutional racism. Beatriz, the bank clerk, not only failed to properly check Marcos's account before making an unfounded accusation about the lack of funds, but she also did so in a public and humiliating manner. This type of discrimination is common in many financial services and occurs for a variety of reasons. The first of these is the implicit racial bias that many professionals carry, often without realizing it, negatively influencing their decisions against black people. The prejudice that Beatriz expressed went beyond the simple mistake of a bad employee. It reflected a deeper and more systemic view that tends to disregard the financial capacity of black people, even when these individuals have a history of success and economic stability. This irrational belief regarding the financial competence of black people is a reflection of structural racism, which permeates society as a whole and is directly reflected in the way they are treated in everyday interactions. Marcos's case is not just an isolated incident. It is the tip of the iceberg of a problem that is often invisible to those who do not experience prejudice in their daily lives. Marcos's reaction, a confrontational stance. But what made Marcos different from other clients who probably went through similar situations and remained silent in the face of prejudice? The answer lies in your attitude towards discrimination. He did not accept being treated as an inferior client. He did not remain silent in the face of public humiliation. Marcos, with the firmness of someone who knows his worth, demanded an explanation. The simple act of asking Beatriz to show her account balance in plain sight was not only a direct challenge to her authority, but also an open questioning of the discriminatory practices that occur invisibly in many institutions. This is a key point. Facing discrimination is not simple. For many, confronting racism in everyday situations means running the risk of being stigmatized as problematic or aggressive. Often, fear of retaliation causes victims of racism to remain silent, perpetuating the normalization of these practices. But Marcos did not bow to shame and fear. He became an example of how when someone decides not to accept the status quo and demand justice, things can start to change. The impact of the video and the public reaction. When customers began filming the scene and the video went viral on social media, a wave of outrage swept the public. What Marcos had faced became a collective battle against structural racism, and his fight became representative of many others. The mobilization on social media was rapid and massive, which caused the situation to take on unexpected dimensions. In a scenario where social and racial inequalities are still profoundly marked, the public visibility of a case like Marcos's generated enormous pressure on the bank, forcing it to recognize the gravity of the situation. The role of social media in changing the narrative. Social media plays a key role in amplifying voices that might otherwise be silenced. The viralization of Marcos's video and the solidarity expressed by other users generated a movement to raise awareness about the discriminatory practices that still occur in financial institutions. This episode exemplifies how technology and social platforms have the power to accelerate change, providing a form of collective resistance in the face of prejudice. In many cases, social media becomes a tool of empowerment for those who do not have access to the same institutional power as Marcos, providing a space where their stories can be shared and their voices heard. The impact on institutions and the necessary change. In Marcos's case, the bank's initial response was an attempt to minimize the incident, with the promise of an internal investigation and the suspension of Beatriz. However, this was not enough for Marcos. He demanded that the bank not only take action against the employee, but that it review its internal policies, offer racial awareness training to all its employees and publicly commit to combating racism in its practices. Real change, as he stated, is not just in punishing individuals who commit racist acts, but in changing the structure of institutions so that discriminatory behaviors are no longer tolerated and, even more importantly, that they do not happen systematically and silently. Organizations need to educate themselves about institutional racism and take concrete steps to ensure that all individuals, regardless of the color of their skin, receive the same treatment and the same opportunities. Marcos's case is a stark reminder that institutional racism is not a rare anomaly, but an everyday reality for many. Statistics and studies demonstrate that racial discrimination is rooted in institutions, but Marcos's example shows that the fight against this type of racism does not need to be silent or invisible. With the mobilization of society, public pressure, and tackling inequalities in the financial field, we can indeed build a fairer future. This fight is not just for one person or one group, but for everyone who wants to live in a world where people are judged by who they really are, and not by the color of their skin. The power of individual actions and social transformation. Marcos's story is more than a simple battle between a customer and a bank employee. It reflects something deeper: the impact that individual actions can have in combating racial discrimination and promoting significant social change. Although institutional racism is a complex and multifaceted structure, Marcos's stance exemplifies how an act of resistance, a firm stance against injustice, can trigger a wave of reflection and transformation. The impact of individual actions on larger systems. When we think about social transformation, we often imagine large movements, political reforms, or collective actions of large proportions. However, the reality is that meaningful change also starts with individual actions. Each action taken by an individual can have a ripple effect, influencing other people and, eventually, affecting entire institutions. Marcos's courage in standing up against the public humiliation he suffered on the bench was not just a matter of self-defense. It was a declaration that he would not accept being treated unfairly, even when faced with the possibility of retaliation. By demanding a public explanation and not being intimidated by the employees' threats, he managed to draw attention to the problem of racism and made his experience an example for others who may be going through something similar but feel powerless to react. Individuals can often feel isolated or vulnerable when confronted with large systems of power. Marcos's story shows that a single voice can become a collective cry, especially when it is supported by values of justice and equality. And when shared on social media, Marcos's story spread, showing how a single act of courage can inspire thousands to stand up and demand change in their own communities and larger institutions. The importance of visibility and solidarity. When the video of the interaction between Marcos and Beatriz went viral, people's reactions were immediate and massive. Those who watched the scene were not silent. Many offered support to Marcos and openly criticized Beatriz's attitude. This solidarity was essential to give visibility to the issue of racism and show that discriminatory attitudes would not be tolerated. Visibility, especially on social media, is a powerful tool for giving a voice to people who often don't have a platform to express their experiences. The support of other people who were present at the scene and the collective support on social media gave Marcos a feeling of unity and strength. He was no longer alone in his fight. He represented a much greater cause. Solidarity is essential when it comes to combating racism. Change does not occur in isolation. It happens when people come together and support each other in their fight for justice. This is essential to create an environment where prejudiced attitudes are more difficult to perpetuate. The supportive reaction was also a demonstration that society is more attentive to issues of discrimination and willing to react when prejudice manifests itself. As Marcos's video gained more attention, many people began to reflect on their own attitudes and what they could do to combat racism in their own spheres of influence, whether in the workplace, family, or community. This awareness process is an important part of social transformation. Awareness as a tool for change. One of the most powerful aspects of Marcos's attitude was the way he used the situation as an opportunity to raise awareness. Rather than allowing the situation to be handled discreetly behind the scenes, he made a point of bringing the issue into the public sphere, demanding that the bank take responsibility not just for its individual actions, but for its institutional policies and practices. Marcos was not content with a simple excuse. He demanded that changes be made within the system. This type of awareness is crucial to combating structural racism. When people become aware of the inequalities that exist, they are more likely to take action to correct these flaws. Awareness of issues of discrimination must go beyond a simple intellectual discussion. It must be accompanied by concrete actions that challenge the discriminatory norms and structures that still exist in institutions and society. The public reflection on racism generated by Marcos's story boosted the debate about the role of companies, organizations, and governments in creating an inclusive environment. Marcos's story also brought to light the need to educate people about different forms of racism. Racism not only manifests itself explicitly, as in situations of open discrimination, but also presents itself in a more subtle way, such as in attitudes and decisions that often go unnoticed. It is critical that people recognize different types of prejudice, such as implicit or structural racism, so that they can address them effectively. Cultural change within organizations. Marcos made it clear that, in addition to individual actions, true transformation must come from within institutions. The bank's action in suspending Beatriz and initiating an internal investigation was a first step, but it was not enough. Marcos made a point of highlighting that real changes need to occur at a structural level, with the review of internal policies and the continuous training of all employees. In the bank's case, The regional manager's response was a sign that the institution was willing to take steps to correct the situation. However, Marcos was incisive in stating that Beatrice's suspension would not be enough, as the change needs to be comprehensive and profound, reaching the institutional culture. He wasn't just interested in a one-off fix. He wanted to see a real commitment to diversity and inclusion. This type of cultural change is challenging but essential. Organizations need to ensure that their policies and practices are inclusive and that their employees are prepared to proactively address issues related to racial discrimination. This involves regular training, developing inclusion programs, and creating an environment where everyone feels respected and valued, regardless of their color or origin. The role of leaders and public policies in transformation. In addition to individual actions, social transformation also depends on the stance of leaders and public policies. Marcos was invited to participate in the bank's awareness initiatives, an important opportunity for him to help shape the way institutions deal with issues of racism in the future. The inclusion of people like him who have a deep understanding of the problem is vital to ensure that the solutions implemented are effective and representative. On the other hand, public policies also play a crucial role in promoting a fairer social environment. Governments at local, state, and federal levels must create laws and regulations that encourage inclusion and equal opportunities, as well as provide oversight mechanisms that ensure companies comply with these standards. Legislation against racial discrimination, although essential, is not sufficient on its own. The creation of effective public policies requires the active participation of civil society, companies, and citizens, as we saw with the mobilization around the Marcos case. The strength of a single act of resistance. Marcos's story highlights the power that individual actions have in creating social change. Not only did he confront the discrimination he experienced, but he also used his experience to challenge the structures and norms that perpetuate institutional racism. His action not only impacted the institution where the episode took place, but also generated a public debate that brought to light crucial questions about racial discrimination in different spheres of society. Through his courage and determination, Marcos was able to transform a painful experience into a platform for debate and collective action. Her story reminds us that although racism is a complex issue rooted in larger structures, it is possible to challenge these structures through individual action and solidarity. This, in turn, can bring about significant cultural, political, and social change. The power of individual actions is undeniable. When someone stands up against injustice, when they refuse to be silenced, that act can not only change that person's life, but also start a broader movement that inspires and encourages others to join the fight for equality and justice. The impact of public mobilization and social media. The incident involving Marcos at the bank not only highlighted issues of racism, but also showed how public mobilization can amplify causes and generate significant changes. With the video going viral, an act that initially appeared to be an isolated confrontation turned into a large-scale awareness movement. The role of social networks as amplifiers of voices that are often on the margins of society has become evident. The power of social networks in the fight against injustice. The rapid dissemination of the video recorded by customers at the bank was not an accident. In modern times, social networks have become powerful platforms to give visibility to problems that could previously be ignored or minimized. The speed with which Marcos's video was shared and commented on showed that social networks have the power to connect people and create a virtual support network that transcends geographic and cultural borders. Social media plays a crucial role in allowing a person's experience, however individual, to gain the reach necessary to provoke public debate. In Marcos's case, his act of resistance became a story shared by thousands of people who felt inspired to fight for a more just world. The public mobilization, fueled by these media, generated pressure on the bank, forcing the institution to position itself clearly and review its policies, not only in the case of Marcos but more broadly. The power of visibility and social pressure. In addition to providing visibility, social networks also exert immense pressure on institutions. The public outrage generated by Beatrice's discriminatory attitude was immediate, and the pressure for answers became increasingly strong as more people engaged in the online debate. This type of social pressure cannot be ignored by companies and organizations that seek to maintain a good public image. However, public mobilization does not just depend on content going viral. It also requires the active participation of the people who are touched by these stories. By engaging in conversations and showing solidarity with Marcos, people demonstrated that they were willing to do more than just watch. They were ready to support the cause and demand change. Thus, public mobilization goes beyond simply sharing content. becoming a more conscious movement that aims to transform attitudes and policies. The transformation of the fight against racism. Marcos's story is not just about an isolated incident in a bank, but about the power of individual actions and the importance of collective mobilization. What began as a public humiliation has turned into a catalyst for change, and that change is not just about holding an individual accountable, but about confronting a system that allows prejudice to silently perpetuate. Society needs to recognize that racism in its various forms cannot be ignored or minimized. Every voice, like Marcos, has the potential to challenge established norms and transform realities. This case clearly illustrates that, by joining forces, both in physical spaces and on digital platforms, public pressure can force institutions and governments to rethink their policies and practices. The impact of a simple video, which would have been just a recording of a moment, reverberated into a movement that resonated across the country. But more importantly, it demonstrated how personal experiences can connect with the struggles of many, uniting people behind a common cause. If we want a future where everyone is treated equally and respectfully, we cannot wait for change to happen on its own. Every act of courage, like Marcos, and every message of solidarity plays a fundamental role. The fight against racism is not a responsibility of some, but of everyone. What happened at that bank was a reflection of a reality that still needs to be combated, but it is also a powerful reminder that we can, indeed, transform situations of injustice into opportunities to redefine social standards. The question is, are you ready to join this fight?